Tonight on The Computer History Museum presents Revolutionaries.
We're 26th in the last study I looked at, right behind Latvia in broadband download speeds. America. It's just, I mean, it's comedy. You can't make this stuff up.
Will the 21st century mark the era when computing liberates the power of democracy, especially at the local level? Gavin Newsom says yes. The California Lieutenant Governor discussed his ideas and his book Citizenville with KQED's Michael Krasny. Major funding for Revolutionaries is provided by the Intel Corporation.
Gavin was interviewed about Citizenville on the Stephen Colbert Show, and I think was a little bit maybe ambushed would be.
That wasn't my finest performance. But
no, I don't want to remind you of that and make you uncomfortable, but I'm bringing it up for a reason here, and that is that he started off in that typical kind of satiric way, parodying and saying, when you were talking about digital stuff, he said, we need a BS translator here. And I was struck by that line because when you hear Jen say API, for example, you're the only elected official maybe who knows what an API is, you realize that a lot of elected officials really don't understand the digital world. I just did a show, some of you may have heard earlier this week, on what does Silicon Valley want out of the Obama administration in the second administration of theirs, particularly with all the money that has been put in from Silicon Valley, more than Wall Street, more than Hollywood. And I thought, I had people who were, many of the experts who were, been working here for many years on the show, and people calling in saying, you go to the legislators, they don't really understand. They don't know what we're about. They don't really have a feel for what we're about. There's one of the biggest challenges in terms of bringing this to the town square, that you're talking about, bringing new technology to town square.
Let me try my best to answer that question, as politicians do, by answering a question that you didn't ask. You know, it is true. It is true. I mean, you know, look, the old adage, if you want a wonderful book, right? You want to move the mouse, you've got to move the cheese. If you want to change behavior, you have to change incentives. And there's never been strong incentive for focusing on the issue of information technology generally in government. I mean, it's not lost on any of us that the last group of people that are going to come in and advocate in a budget crisis for technology over healthcare or over programs for seniors, they just don't exist. People don't line up with stickers. They don't line up in buses coming down to City Hall or state government demanding more information technology. And so the challenge for governmental leaders is to realize its potential and its possibility and its meaning and its purpose. That said, does it surprise any of you that last week, in big headline in the LA Times, the Department of Motor Vehicles just gave up on a 6-year effort to update its 40-year-old technology for the issuances of licenses. We have already spent more than half the money. It's not even close to halfway done, and they just ended the contract. Is it a surprise to any of you, talk about scandals in government, that the court system of California in 2004 identified a $260 million upgrade that was to be complete in 2008, $260 million. Today, the estimate is $1.9 billion to connect 58 counties and their case management system, with no expectation in sight that it will be done before 2015. The payroll upgrades in California, contract to $371 million. The contractor was also just fired, got less attention a week ago than the DMV. The CalPERS, our big retirement system, consolidating 49 data centers into one. The cost overrun at $228 million, and everyone now is more upset with the consolidation than they were previously. Yet we fixate, don't we, on something all of you know in California, and that is we had a few extra $1 million in the Recreation and Parks Department that we didn't spend, but the money's still there, and it wasn't used during a downturn. There's been hundreds of articles on that, and not about billions of dollars of waste and inefficiency, and I would argue corruption. by those that service that industry but not service it well. So it's not a surprise that
Except with the
people,
state parks, the money, they didn't even know the money was there.
They didn't even know the money was there.
It sort of went underground or it disappeared, didn't it?
No, and I mean, no one's pleased with that, and it deserved a lot of attention. But my gosh, think about all these other examples. And they're just, I can go on and on. Those are just some contemporary, truly.
So you're telling us the
examples.
government is not working as it should be.
It's
You're
not
telling us
focused on this.
it's
Not focused on this.
all right. And so where do the citizens come in? Where did the link to the town square to come in?
Well, what's happened, I mean, so increasingly my argument in the book is there's this new digital divide taking shape. And it's less and less. 5 years ago, if I were on your show, Michael, and I was, when we were talking about free Wi-Fi in San Francisco and the importance of dealing with socioeconomic issues of technology and providing access to broadband and high speed, not just access in terms of ubiquity in our public housing units, increasingly that's beginning to take shape with the cost of these devices dropping precipitously. The cost not only as it relates to access here in America, but you've seen the access now around the rest of the world. 63% of people in India have access to cell phones, only 47% access to toilets. A world remarkably where we're becoming more and more wired, this world brain people talk about. But with government, this divide continues to get wider and wider and wider. You're used to a world of Amazon. You can shop 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, have something delivered, and then you go to the DMV. You go down to your local building department. You go and engage to pay a parking ticket, and all of a sudden you realize that divide. And so my fear is this: citizens are now more engaged peer-to-peer, more engaged directly as we move through a framework of not just social networks, but mobility, the localization of services, and now the access and the ubiquity of the cloud. We're stuck with this old top-down IT cartel mindset, I say lovingly. This notion that we could build these systems and servers in a world where now you have this on-demand resource, the cloud, and you're always getting the next best iteration. You're renting, not even buying, and yet we're still building in government.
Oh, you say in
and it
your
no
book
longer is relevant to the world we're living in. Is my
You
point.
say in your book the cloud's going to transform everything. I mean, you almost sound like you're prescient on that score, but when you talk about engagement of citizen to citizen, we're talking about a virtual engagement still, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I mean, that engagement now, when I talk about peer-to-peer, I think about Donors Choose. I think of Kiva.org. I think of Kickstarter, Indiegogo. I could go on and on, these examples where people are saying, you know what, I'm kind of fed up with local government, state government, federal government. I'm sick and tired of Hagel hearings and haggling around filibusters, cloture, I don't even know what the heck that is, sequestration, who made that word up? I'm just disconnected. You know what, but I want to solve problems. I want to engage. I want to make a difference. Particularly this younger generation, this millennial generation, 30 and younger, this generation they call generation of choice, the net generation, the generation of you, a world where everything's being customized.
You call them digital natives, and you have a great deal of faith and confidence in them, but
Yeah.
I must tell you, in many respects, I mean, aside from wanting to commit themselves, because of course, I work with them as a college professor and so forth, and I mean, they're around you to a great extent, and we're certainly in your campaigns, but perhaps maybe some of your confidence there is a bit inflated in terms of optimism about their commitment to, and many of them seem quite apathetic. They care about environmental issues, they care about their own education, secondary education, so forth, but fixing government, which is really what you're talking about here,
Yeah.
reforming government, a lot of them have kind of checked out of apathy and out of disillusionment.
Well, I'm not for fixing government as an end in and of itself, but as a means to deal with our great challenges. I mean, this generation's more empathetic than any other generation in history. This generation's more engaged peer-to-peer and volunteering. The data bears that out. It's one of the smartest generations ever. Just think of IQ scores are increasing, not decreasing. You can't get into college. It's more difficult now than ever. The grade point averages, SAT scores are higher than ever. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. And they're more engaged, again, peer-to-peer solving problems. Now, don't get me wrong. There's sort of the Malcolm Gladwell argument of slacktivism, and people just think you can like or dislike to change the world or tweet a constitution, as someone
There's also the Gladwell argument that you hit a tipping point sometime where citizenry is concerned, and I mean, you get into sometimes just citizen apathy, don't you?
Again, well, understandably, the apathy comes if we just. I mean, well, let me back up. Let me just make an argument. Why this book? What the heck? What's Citizenville all about? I've been thinking a lot about the issue of leadership. Being in public life, being outside of public. I come from a small business background. I come from the private sector into government, from an entrepreneurial frame. And I remember reading years and years ago, one of my favorite authors is Tom Peters. And he had a book where he noted
he asked, what did Martin Luther King, Václav Havel, Nelson Mandela, Havel, King, Mandela, and Gandhi all have in common? And he said, he answered his own question, the peak of their influence, they had one thing in common, and that was jail time. Which is just sort of the question. And he went on to express, said, the other thing, they just exercised their moral authority. You think about that, Gandhi, Havel, King, Mandela, the peak of their influence, changing the world. None of them had formal authority. This whole idea of leadership, that you have to be someone to do something, was challenged. You can even argue, if you look at Havel and Mandela, Havel in Czechoslovakia, Mandela in South Africa, that after they formalized their authority, got elected, they actually lost a little bit, you can argue, of their influence. And so it got me thinking about the role of elected officials, those that have this formal authority, and the role of citizens.
You haven't done time, have you?
I haven't done time. Fair point. But this idea that we have to wait around for the guy or gal on the white horse. And, I've been waiting around for the guy or gal on the white horse. And, some were expecting it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. He wasn't a Democrat or Republican. Married to Maria Shriver, that's good. Didn't need them, got in and didn't change everything. And President Obama, some have been very enlivened, others have been a little, this notion that we have to wait around for someone else to solve our problems. So it got me walking down this path of, well, what the hell is going on with us? As Jen was saying, citizenship. And you start thinking about this contours of change, the overstated but important Facebook youth of Tahrir Square, the Indignados in Spain, and what's happening obviously with these populist movements here in America with the Occupy movement, the Tea Party, et cetera, that there's this energy out there,
but you even
this desire to engage.
I should mention, Gavin even found himself going to Estonia, South Korea, as well as interviewing a lot of people in search of innovation that's ahead of what we have. Yeah. There are places, in fact, throughout the globe now that are ahead of the learning curve in terms of what you're talking about.
Well, Estonia, this is a good story. I start the book with the story of Tuomas, the president of Estonia. He comes in, he's going to come down to the valley, and he had to do the proverbial meeting with the mayor of San Francisco to justify the taxpayer expense of the Estonia taxpayers, and came by, and I was waxing on about all these great initiatives we're going to do. We're going to be able to pay our parking tickets or parking meters on our cell phones, and I was telling about our Wi-Fi initiatives with Google and all these wonderful things. And I knew he spoke perfect English, but he had his translator there, as a lot of foreign leaders do for protocol. He kept looking at his translator as if something was lost in translation, and instead of having his translator respond, he said, hold on. We've been doing all of that for decades. And here I was trying to, the young mayor, hey, the Silicon Valley, let me tell you, sir, how it is. And I realized quickly, to your point, Michael, in 1991, they came out of the Soviet Union. They skipped a whole generation. They leapfrogged. We're stuck with these old legacy systems, aren't we? These old 5, 10, 20-year contracts with these old systems, God bless us. And these guys just leapfrogged the whole thing. And as a consequence, Estonia today has 200% penetration rate in smartphones. They've been paying parking tickets, all these things for years and years. It doesn't surprise you. We're now 26th. Depends on the day of the week and what study, but we're 26th in the last study I looked at, right behind Latvia in broadband download speeds. America. It's just, it's comedy. You can't make this stuff up. So we're stuck in this industrial mindset, this top-down hierarchical mindset that is being challenged by what I call in the book these armies of Davids. And these armies of Davids aren't using slingshots to take down large institutions. They're using technology increasingly. And I just think the reality for us as government officials is we've got to wake up to this. And we've got to start meeting people where they are. And we cannot deny the contours of this change are already taking place. That, in your world, and we talked about this on your show a few weeks ago, media, blogging, newspapers, the publishing industry, my gosh, it's obvious now in hindsight. But a lot of us didn't see that coming. And the music industry, till Steve Jobs created a way of monetizing that with Napster, all of a sudden that industry, so we're not buying albums anymore. You're seeing in the financial service industry, those contours have changed. We're having a wonderful debate at the UC CSU about online education, the Khan Academy, flipping the classroom and a framework K through 12, extending that narrative with folks at Udacity University, Coursera, edX, and higher education with these wonderful people changing the online.
Forgive me,
engagement.
since you are
These
a region,
contours are changing.
you are serving as a region, you're serving in your capacity as Lieutenant Governor on the CSU as well as the UC boards. What about the educational system? I mean, in terms of training citizenship in young people, isn't that also the responsibility of the institutions and the college and universities that we go to in California?
So I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and I was telling you this before. You know, and any of you with kids or grandkids, you've all had this experience. She pulls out my iPhone a couple years ago, and I'm just mesmerized. I mean, she's everything but my password. She's discovering things I didn't know existed. And I thought, as many of you, that she's a prodigy. This is that one, and here she is.
Did she spend time in Estonia?
No, but I mean, she might as well. She actually, she speaks that language. And so we talk about these digital natives. And then, about a year ago, she got, they start early, this preschool. And I looked around, and every single one of these kids maybe they weren't prodigies. They were all just wired differently. And so it's this evolution of thinking that got me thinking, you can't educate my daughter like I was educated. Her brain's not wired like my brain's wired. I mean, talk about this generation of choice and customization. I mean, you can't have a row of desks and a bell that was ringing during Ben Franklin's time with single subjects and teacher in this mass education environment, this fast food environment of education, and expect that she's even going to be engaged, let alone excel. This notion of having people based on their date of manufacture be lined up, in these rows of desks is comedy.
So how does your daughter how does she learn about civic citizenship and about dedication to change in the kind of way? I mean, you're talking about really reforming a democratic system, reforming capitalism. You're talking about, the big things that many people want to get on board with, but you're talking to children now who are coming up looking at their games that they have. And I know Farmville comes into your book and all of those ideas and apps to get people motivated, but they're looking a lot of time. You go almost anywhere nowadays and you see kids looking, not only kids, adults, let's face it, just looking at their iPhone or looking at their computer, whatever form it is.
And that's why we have to meet people where they are. 500 million people on the planet spending more than an hour a day playing online games. If you're 21 years or younger, you've probably read these stats. You have spent more time playing online games than you have spent in the classroom between the grades 6th and 12th grade. 53 hours a week if you're 8 to 18, you're in the entertainment media space. It's an extraordinary. And by the way, it's not just young folks. 42-year-old women, the typical face of online games. And it's not just Farmville, it's all these things. Yet in Farmville, we're cultivating crops virtually, and we're spending money to do it. You couldn't make that up a few years ago. So how do we meet people where they are and educate and entertain? I remember Schoolhouse Rock? I mean, we all remember, it's indelible in our lives, right? We were educated and entertained. We learned how to build, became law, except for the persuasion industry was left out, the lobbyists. But everything else made sense, and we need to update that. But that whole idea of educating and entertaining, edutainment, horrible
It's a word that should have been retired a long time ago.
Should have been, I'm with you. But this idea that we can begin to meet people where they are is fundamental in this book. That's what the rift on Farmville, Citizenville.
So how does it get people to be activists in terms of getting money out of politics, or for that matter, making government more transparent? These are things you take up, and I'm particularly struck by the idealism of it, but wondering on a practical and pragmatic level how it's viable and how it's going to work.
Well, the default in government is secrecy. Just think of the drone debate in the last few weeks, right? Even arguably the most transparent president in our nation's history was prone to that default on the issue of drones, particularly as it relates to the kill list of American citizens.
President who said he was going to be transparent.
And has been, I think, objectively more transparent than any other.
Well, but the drones are a good example of, and we've learned from Assange and from WikiLeaks to what extent government has kept secrets from the public. And if the public is going to find transparency, they're not going to find it from the government.
Well, that's right. That said, I subscribe to Stuart Brand's old notion that information wants to be free, and ultimately it might make its way in public. Look, we live in a fishbowl society. We live in a glass house. I know I learned this the hard way as mayor. And it's folks like you that hold us to account, and appropriately so. The Freedom of Information Act local government here in California, we talk about sunshine laws. And it's usually in a frame of gotcha. I mean, anytime, if Michael Krasny asks for Freedom of Information Act, I know I'm in serious trouble. I know it's an overtime issue, some expose, some 5-part series. And so by definition, right, I mean, you all know that. And then, San Jose Mercury News today after a 2-year investigation under the Freedom of Information. It's just a bad, so government, we're paranoid, we're anesthetized because we know that gotcha framework is going to be engaged. My point is that we've gone well past that. WikiLeaks was a perfect reminder of that. That the issue of secrecy, as we've noted, the issue of privacy generally, has evolved dramatically. And so my argument is the default needs to be.
You say in your book there is no privacy anymore.
I'd like to think there is, but I argue that that's being questioned. Privacy is now being used as a currency, right? Because you can buy your way to more customized services using or giving up your privacy. I argue you have to have privacy and transparency. You got to be more transparent so that we can have informed consent about giving up our privacy. There's a lack of informed consent. You don't even realize the minute you download an app, you've now just subscribed to all kinds of things that, mostly for benign purposes, but that have given up your privacy. And we've pushed allow, don't allow, and that gives you a little bit of jump. But when you go through those 450 pages of legalese, that's not informed consent when you ultimately provide that. A lot of folks, especially my age, the sort of digital immigrants learning this language, we'd rather spend that extra dollar and not give up that privacy. But I do believe privacy, as we know, particularly with this new generation with all those digital breadcrumbs that have lived their lives in that glass house, become less and less significant. I don't want to give up on this notion. But in government, look, it's your government. It's your taxpayer dollars. It's not our information to hoard. It's your right to know. You subsidize it. You paid for it. I mean, Tim O'Reilly reminded me years ago, one of the fathers of this movement may have been unknowingly Ronald Reagan. In the 80s, when he gave up all of that satellite information and made it public, every single one of us in this room are beneficiaries of it. You drove here in a car that most likely has GPS. That information is public information that's been accessed by this remarkable taxpayer investment. Your weather information on your smartphone right now is AccuWeather, Weather Channel. All these things exist. It used to be in the hands of NOAA, this Oceanic Atmospheric Association. It was hoarded, even though you subsidized and paid for it. This notion of openness is not just about someone's schedule or overtime. It's about this treasure trove, these vaults of information that exist in your Recreation and Parks Department, your Building Department, down there at Department of Public Works, all across this country, cities large and small, that we want to open up in a transparent way, an open way, and allow the private sector to mash up third-party developers, to take that information and to form new connections that government cannot form. And in turn, the more open you are, the more transparent, we start building trust again. And we start seeing people more willing to answer your question, to engage when they trust that their engagement has purpose. It
goes beyond trust, though, Gavin. It goes into citizens demanding and somehow leveling the importance of accountability of politicians, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's certainly that. But I'm arguing for active citizenship, participation. And participation's not voting every 2 or 4 years. It's a farce. We turn your voices on, don't we? I mean, just think about, and President Obama is trying to reconcile this, but think about what happened in 2008. 35,000 self-organizing communities come together through mybarackobama.com. All these voices are amplified, engaged, this remarkable email campaign, and all that energy, one crescendo, a victory, a win. And then they say, you know what, we want to keep your voices amplified. Remember what happened in 2008. And they converted mybarackobama.com to change.gov. And the president said, I want to hear from you. No one-way conversations anymore. We had this conversation where these organized communities came together. You were having two-way conversations. We were engaged in these two-way conversations. We don't believe in the broadcast model anymore. You vote, I decide. We don't believe that. You vote, we decide. Wonderfully enlightened. Change.gov comes up. President, a few weeks after the election, has a big town hall meeting. People submit their priorities: war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, war on terror, climate change, financial service meltdown. No. The communities came together, and their number one priority, legalize marijuana. President did exactly what you did. Said, made some flippant remark. And you may recall, go back, people were furious because they were serious. And then immediately you can go, by the way, check it right now because we all can use cell phones here, which I love. Check change.gov. See what it says. You're
going to make a campaign promise about
No, it transitioned, meaning was reconfigured into whitehouse.gov, meaning disappeared. Yeah. And we went back to this broadcast model. You voted, we decided, or I decided if I'm president. Now he's trying to reconcile that with organizing for action. But it's still around a political frame to get you to activate for the agenda, as opposed to this iterative two-way conversation. And you all know this in the private sector, and I've got 15 businesses. I've learned this the hard way. This notion of one-way conversations, they're dead. People demand a two-way conversation. But technology, from my perspective, the whole issue is something remarkable. You all know this, and that's what this museum represents. Something extraordinary is happening that's bigger than I think most of us in government understand. And you're seeing, as I said, the contours of this change. And when I say I got a little trouble on Colbert, I was trying to make an argument, but in quick sound bites, which is impossible, I learned my lesson. This notion that big is getting small and small is getting big. And that's the notion of these armies of Davids. These individuals self-organizing and bringing down, toppling government. The challenge is in this age, as some have called, age of amateurs, that we're good at toppling government. We're not necessarily good at transitioning and formalizing a governance structure. Someone said, my friend Nathan Gardell said, you can't tweet a constitution. Maybe not. But his point is principle, that this is a difficult transition, but the technology is an enabling force to galvanize and organize, and for people peer-to-peer to come together across their differences, and it's profound. And I think government is still operating with that vending machine model, not this platform notion that Steve Jobs ultimately advanced. Remember, Jobs came out with the iPhone with less than a dozen apps. He's not in the app business. There are over 800,000 apps on the iPhone platform and 700,000+ on Android. It was the whole idea of third-party developers. And it got me thinking, Eric Liu is a good friend of mine. He wrote a wonderful book, Gardens of Democracy. He talks about being big on what and small on how. Let's deal with the issues of ignorance, poverty, and disease, but let's be less prescriptive about how we actually solve these problems. Let government be a convener, a curator of sorts. Let's truly engage that remarkable wisdom that exists in every single one of you. The old adage, no one's an expert in everything, but everyone's an expert in something. How do we source that crowd, you, we, and engage in beginning design and ultimately solve so many of our vexing troubles?
When I hear you talk about prison and Gandhi and the others serving time, and when I hear you use words like toppling government, or at least that kind of language, and this is a revolutionary series, I did an interview with Ghonim, who was for Google sending all those messages from Tahrir Square and sending them to other Egyptians. Maybe something along those lines that can galvanize the people. I remember talking about the fact that we haven't had anything that has galvanized the Occupy movement, maybe being an exception, but like you said, no coherence or leadership to it. We haven't had anything that galvanized people since the Civil Rights Movement, really. We had an anti-war movement, which I was part of, which many probably people here were part of, and the same with the Civil Rights Movement as with the anti-Vietnam War movement, but there hasn't been anything like that since in American history that can get the public out there into public square. I mean, you're talking about town square, and you're talking about what brought them out in Tahrir Square was they realized it was in their own interest. They wanted to topple the government. They wanted Mubarak out. There are things about this government that need to be toppled. I'm not suggesting revolution necessarily.
No.
I'm going to go back to my 60s. It's a little passé for me at this stage of my life, but when you are sort of, in a sense, proselytizing and implicitly preaching something that's really revolutionary, aren't you?
Well, I want to, it's interesting, as someone who's in government, I don't trust centralized power. Maybe I just know how we exercise it. And I'd like to decentralize that. I want to, as we say, devolve and involve. I want more voices and more choices in government. And maybe I say that as a taxpayer, not just as an elected official. And I want to engage citizens in truly a substantive two-way conversation. Government is not an election. And we tend to think, boy, our work's done. Boy, we got the right person in office. Again, counting on this idea the guy or gal on the white horse is going to come save the day and do things for us. And we kind of allow ourselves to be treated as subjects, not citizens. And I'm reminded of what Justice Brandeis said in a democracy, the most important office is the office of citizen. We've kind of forgotten that. I mean, Jen's right. That's where it all begins. We've forgotten our collective responsibility to engage and not just be passive. I don't want things done to me. I want things done with me. And I imagine when you're a customer at business, you feel the same way. Well, why don't you feel the same way when you go up to the counter in government? You allow us to do things to you, not with you. I don't understand it. And we've kind of accepted that. So I'm not calling for a revolution, just an evolution of thinking. I want to flip this thing around. It's bottom-up thinking. It's not top-down thinking. It's not that machine thinking.
Do you remember what happened in the campaign? By the way, I was going to ask you to talk about Obama 2.0, about the influence of government 2.0, but before we go there, when he gave what appeared to be a lackluster debate, suddenly the numbers went down, suddenly he was in a fight for his life to regain the presidency, and the fact of the matter is, suddenly there was a realization that everything depended not only on advertising money, of course, and saturating the airwaves, like you said, but depended on performance. I mean, politics is a performance
Theater.
art, and it is a form of making people get to like you, winning the Q factor, coming off as committed, passionate, charming, all of those kinds of things. You know what they say in Hollywood, you've made it once you begin to know how to fake sincerity.
I thought you were going to say in politics is acting for ugly people.
No, but we have to,
no,
I mean, that's true too, but we have to take that sense of the second debate after that was essentially a kind of adversarial contest. It was what Deborah Tannen said, our media has become, it's oppositional culture, and you know, who's going to get the biggest haymaker and who's going to get the best punches.
Yeah,
and
it's
so forth.
depressing.
We're talking about no, I don't want to depress.
No, I am. I mean,
we're talking
depressed.
about the culture and changing the culture
you
through
gotta change the
technology.
culture. Well, I hope so. I mean, among other things. Look, you know, I mean, it's one thing, you know, this book is an anthem of, well, I'm biased. I come from local government. I believe the one form of government that still works relatively well is local government. It's the old adage, if you don't like the way the world looks when you're standing up, stand on your head and go local. You'll see remarkable things happening. And so I have a big bias for mayors, city administrators, city council members, boards of supervisors. You know, I remember, imagine what Michael would have said if I came out with a Democratic plan in San Francisco to clean up graffiti. People say, what the heck is he talking about? Or my colleagues came out with a Republican plan to sweep the streets. I mean, it just makes no sense at a local level. Boy, I get into California politics. There is a Democratic plan for this, a Republican plan for that. We've come to expect it. There's a hard-headed pragmatism at the local level. I've always said ideologues make lousy mayors, mayors make lousy ideologues. You got to get things done. And one of the nice things is proximity confers a little bit more legitimacy. We tend to be a little more locally optimistic than we do state and federally. A little more pessimistic when it comes to the rest of the
add that I used to say politicians make lousy talk show hosts and talk show hosts make lousy politicians, but you were the exception. Gavin was actually very good on current television.
Thank you. Al Jazeera. Thank you, yes. For 1 week.
Let me
sweet.
go to some of the questions from the audience, and thank you for these, by the way. Looking through them, just scouting through them, looked like some very good questions, and get some responses from you. The Occupy movement was, in a way, citizens taking control, organized on Facebook, Twitter, yet this bottom-up approach failed to make real change like the Tea Party did in a top-down approach. Is bottom-up realistic?
Bottom-up's absolutely realistic, and I would argue, just watching the rough elbows of the ready, fire, aim crowd that Ted Cruz represents, the Tea Party is still alive and well. Sadly, I'd like to think it's dissipated. It perhaps has, but it still resonates and will, I think, substantially in the sequester debate and the run-up to 2014 and the concern folks have of being primaried. I think it's changed their behavior. They've become hostages to that ideological rigidity.
I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I was appalled by the fact that we had the all-star voting, and I was a kid in Cleveland, and all the Cincinnati Reds got elected, the players of the Cincinnati Reds, because they just stuffed the ballot box.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a good metaphor for what I'm talking about.
Well, that's what happened with the example, the medical marijuana, or
Yeah.
the issue of legalizing marijuana more broadly, is that you had the king of the hill scenario where folks got in and they took over. And now there's a lot of sites, which is nice. I mean, Localocracy, Quora.com are some examples of sites that are that you have to have, your name has to be your real name. There's a real participatory framework. There are these new forums, Delphi and others, that are beginning to allow more rational conversations than the conversations that are oftentimes hijacked by the loudest voices.
I'll go to some more questions from the audience here. If Facebook can be built in a dorm room and connect 1 billion users on a two-way communication platform like no other, why not get the CSU and UC computer science departments to build the IT system of the future for our state? Give extra credit.
Amen, but you got it. Well, here's the worst part. You know, you've all had this experience, right? I mean, you look at government, we have this, something called an RFI, and then we have an RFQ, and then we do an RFP. That's response for information, response for questionnaire, then a response for proposal, goes through a procurement cycle, we have public hearings, lowest, most responsive bid, then it goes through more public cycle, then we're termed out, and then it starts over because the new people come in and want to have their fingerprints, and this stuff never happens. Thus, the IT examples I gave you. I mean, how's it possible to go from 260 million to 1.9 billion? It's because we went through different administrations, people were fired, they come and go, the companies themselves merge. The example of the DMV started with EDS out of Texas. HP bought EDS, and then a division of HP, didn't necessarily perform as they hoped. That said, you all have the counterexample of your 13-year-old niece, who over the weekend, for nothing, put together some fancy website. And you go, how's that possible? When we just went through a procurement, an RFQ, RFP, RFI, over 2 years for $3 million to do the same damn website. So my argument, so to your question, I don't necessarily want government at CSU and UC to be building out some big, heavy top-down system. Not when you can get an app that does that you can download. So it's all, talk about citizen engagement. We have to move away from this inside-out thinking to this outside-in thinking.
Please talk about climate change, how technology can stimulate action.
Love that debate. Well, this is where I'm locally biased. At the end of the day, what's the sum total of all consumption is local consumption. If you look at the planet today, we're now dominantly urbanized. First time in human history in 2005, more people on the planet were living in urban centers than rural and urban areas combined. 1 million to 1.5 million people every single week moving into cities. This is the century of urbanization. You look at the United States, 75% of our GDP coming out of urban areas. And you look at the politics nationwide, dominantly becoming urbanized as it relates to the popular vote. That said, the issue of climate change, I see from that perspective, not getting lost at this top-down perspective, but again, bottom-up. What are mayors doing in cities large and small all across the country? What are their specific decisions that drive their consumption habits and their energy efficiency habits and the like? That's why, I remember, boy, you remember this one, gay marriage was controversial, sure, but you had fun with me when we required composting in San Francisco. Now that was controversial. I mean, that drove people batty. The editor of the San Francisco Examiner sent the garbage police to my home to photograph my garbage to make sure that my egg shells were being appropriately put in the green bin and not the black bin. My only point of saying all this is technology.
But you never told us as mayor how much we had to drink.
No, I didn't do the big gulps. So if I'd thought of it, maybe I would have done that. God bless Michael Bloomberg. Maybe I wouldn't have gone that far. Who knows? This nanny state. I did on my book tour, I did the sort of Sean Hannity side of that. That didn't go so well, some of these composting ideas and all that. But I believe in these principles, and I believe the local government can advance some of these principles. But here's the big idea on technology. We play with a lot of technology as it relates to issues like finding a recycling center. The first app on our open app store we did in San Francisco was called EcoFinder. We put the information up, what we called in a machine-readable, downloadable way. It was basically just putting all our information online, and the first app we did in San Francisco was some guy the next day said, here's an EcoFinder map because we care about recycling. And now there's an app for that. You could download it for free. And it's made easy. It was right after the composting decision. Cisco came to us, and they have their new program called Connected Cities. And they said, we want a connected bus. And they took one of our muni buses and converted it. And you can read out on the bus how much consumption you're using and all this other information where, again, it was transparency. There was an app they created for the city, not dissimilar, where they took the idea of a bus and they brought it down to your zip code, and you can compare neighbor to neighbor what your energy consumption is. And you could start having a competition. You're seeing the next iteration of games that are doing the same thing with companies like Spigot that are creating literally virtual games where they draw citizen engagement and more use of transparency and data in this context, that they're designing data. A great example is Zeitgeist. You can download this through the Sunlight Foundation. Wonderful. They take all that census data, all these numbers, and they went with, was it IDEO in the East Bay? And they had these guys who were the originate, you saw the original Mac was designed by these guys over there. And they said, take this data and help us design it. Create a story around this data. And now there's an app site, Zeitgeist, that literally designs data in a way that's meaningful and relevant. And that's ways we can begin to process this kind of change in behavior and understanding and capacity building around the issues of climate change and
That's very encouraging. How about the new technology just in terms of earthquakes, in terms of disasters, and also things like a flood of refugees, unforeseen contingency?
Here's the great challenge. There's these doomsday era folks say, well, why should we waste our time in the United States with all this stuff? Because if China does what China is going to do and all these other emerging, what's the point? And then they just sort of make the case, buy a Prius, please. You can't buy enough Prius that make a difference. This is all just a waste of time. Buy a plastic bag, don't buy, it doesn't matter. Plastic water bottles, don't even waste your time.
Vote, waste your time.
Waste your time.
Yeah.
All these things. But, my point ultimately is that success leaves clues. And you've got to be willing to demonstrate the success or efficacy of a plastic bag ban, of a requirement that all your taxi cabs need to be alternative fueled, of a composting requirement, of a green building standard that raises the bar in terms of remodels, not just new construction, of your energy efficiency strategies. And it's the sum total of all those efforts that create a city like San Francisco. It's the most sustainable big city in America. And it's one of the most economically vibrant, proving the point, and not an or. And that leaves a clue to folks when you go over to Guangzhou or wherever else. And they say, you know what, I hear San Francisco's doing so. And all of a sudden, the leaders there start thinking differently and ultimately acting differently. So I'm not going to excuse inaction because it's just too big, and those folks are too powerful, and we can't have an impact.
How well developed is our disaster plan for technological electrical grid destruction by solar flare or expanding meteor?
Come on. I mean, we're still trying to 40-year-old technology at the DMV. And you're going to talk about cybersecurity? Or
well, we're going to talk about it now. What we just
disasters?
discovered is in Shanghai, or apparently is in Shanghai, hacking into Google and hacking into probably everything that's down here in Silicon Valley.
You got it. I mean, we're so ill-equipped and prepared to protect power plants, water sources, utilities of all stripes, large and small. This is serious stuff. I don't get paranoid about this, except when you're on the UC Regents, you also are able to connect to Lawrence Livermore Labs, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and Sandia Labs, where a lot of this stuff is being organized. You spend 10 minutes there, you come back, you go, you start reading Thoreau.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Thoreau.
Sorry.
Because I was always struck by that story about Thoreau and Emerson, which probably many people in the listening audience know. And we get back to that whole willingness to take risks where punishment is concerned. Thoreau refused to pay the poll tax that went to support the Spanish-American War, and the story was maybe apocryphal. Emerson went to see him, said, "Henry, why are you in there?" And Thoreau said, "Why are you out there?" Meaning, if you had, the commitment that you should have, you should be here in jail. Okay. What you're saying to people in some respect is take risks, aren't you? The technology allows you to take more risks.
Yeah. No, I mean, in the book,
and the risks bring consequences.
Yeah, no one, and we're scared to death of tomorrow's headline. Politicians are inherently scared of risks, or scared of being exposed. In my little businesses, I have a failure award. I literally give a bonus to the person in my business. I have close to 1,000 employees, 800 and some odd employees. The person who screws up the best wins a bonus of about $800. It's a failure award. I'll just very briefly explain what I'm talking about. I have a hotel in Lake Tahoe in Squaw Valley. In the summer, there's a lot of mosquitoes. It's an old hotel, so we don't have great air conditioning, so we leave the doors open in the hallways in the evening. A lot of the windows are open, so the mosquito issue is a legitimate issue. I had one of those crazy night clerks. You know, those folks come in at 11 o'clock at night and apparently are awake when you get there at 2 in the morning for a late check-in and take off at 6 in the morning. It's a different kind of person. They're wired differently. So this guy brilliantly said, I've got an idea. And before he came to work, he went down and he purchased a bunch of catfish. And he said, you know what? I know the source of all these mosquitoes. There are all these ponds around the hotel. So he dumped a bunch of the catfish in. Great idea. Until the next morning, my phone rings. Unaware of this, I get a phone call from Ludo, who's my engineer for 10 years. He calls me in a panic. He says, I don't know what the hell just happened. He says, it's 8 in the morning, and no one explained to me, but there are dead fish all up and down the hallways of the hotel. It's the strangest damn thing. There are piece carcasses, the heads, the eyeball, the whole thing. Fish tails. I don't know what happened. Well, we sourced it. We found out it was this night clerk, again, that bought those catfish, put them in, and we thought, what a glorious screw-up. The guy took initiative to try to solve a problem. It turns out the raccoons had a field day, and we're in a frenzy and a daze, and we're running up and down the hallways, you know, in this feast. Now, that was worth $800. And I go, you know, so that's my orientation, you know, fail forward fast. You miss 100. We talked about Edison a moment ago. Remember he said, you know, I never failed. It's absurd. The New York Times, you failed 1,000 times to create this thing, this light bulb, this light thing. What? You must feel humiliated. 1,000 mistakes. Said, I succeeded in, you know, learning or ultimately discovering 1,000 ways of not doing something until he ultimately stumbled on a way of doing something. That you want to, I mean, it's the old thing. What was it Churchill said? The secret of all success. This is Winston Churchill. So don't pay attention. Churchill said, right? The secret of all success is moving from failure to failure with enthusiasm. Damn. So I've embraced these principles, but in government, hold on. My gosh. So you try to do Wi-Fi, you failed. You just all hat, no cattle, Mr. Mayor. Can't deliver a damn thing. What's it like failing? Just terrible. All your naysayers becomes a campaign ad, the whole thing, so you're risk adverse. I mean, isn't that the civil service system? Standard operate, 9 to 5 mentality. You know this, I say this lovingly. The only way you get fired, this is an exaggeration for emphasis, but one way you get fired is not doing your job effectively. It's trying to do the job of someone else effectively. Breaking out of the standard operating procedure. That was not your job, sir. I mean, we had a contract provision. This is the largest in public employee. I'm a big labor guy. But this stunned me when I first became mayor. I got a lot of grief for this, a lot of protests.
You're pointing your finger at me.
No, because you talked about it. I'll listen to the radio. And it said, in the largest, it was 17, I think it was 17,000 members of our bureaucracy. It said performance reviews, comma, and disciplinary records. Performance reviews and disciplinary records cannot be considered with regard to promotion in a class. In the contract. It says your performance and your disciplinary records cannot be considered. You're automatically eligible for promotion. So you could spend 27 years, and the guy next to you spent 26 years and 11 months, done an exceptional job. You've done a terrible job. That person may not be promoted.
Of course, when you talk about that politically, or when you talk about the inequality of income, economic inequality, then you suddenly see this flaming going on in the blogosphere about, I mean, they'll call you a socialist the same way they've been calling Barack Obama.
Well, I've called everything, so I haven't been there, done that. You can't be mayor of San Francisco and not be a socialist. Yeah, I'm thinking $9 a minimum wage. I mean, come on, Mr. President, we're at $10.55. They talk about paid sick leave. I mean, we've been there, done that 10 years. Preschool, we did universal preschool 5 years ago. You know, I think it's all interesting, isn't it, San Francisco? Because it's the worst nightmare of the right. Because every single thing they say is the end of the world as we know it. We've done every single one of them. And we're thriving and we're growing. Just a fact. We're outperforming almost any big city in the United States of America. I mean, the city's vibrant. You know, we have universal health care. We already did that years and years ago. Not universal health insurance. Mistake. Health care. Profound distinction, and one that still concerns me about the broader implementation of health insurance reform. But this city, I guess I'm pointing out, these values are not so bad. They're not socialist values.
They're Nancy
American
Pelosi
values.
San Francisco values, according to Sean
Whatever.
Hannity et al.
I know. I have a soft spot for Sean. I feel sorry for his arguments.
Without necessarily being a, quote, knight on a white horse, when might you run for president? Please elaborate.
Yeah, right.
why.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. My little niece is here. She submitted that. No. You know, I am struck. I mean, I really am by this notion of formal and informal authority. I think of all those folks, Gordon Moore, those guys. I mean, think of the impact Eric and those folks have had on the world. And think of the impact a lot of those folks you forgot about that were former mayors, governors, presidents. I don't know. You know, I see, you know, I remember last year, and I know our time's almost up, but we had a deal in California with the Republican leaders and the Democratic leaders to do a version of some pension reform, temporary taxes. We were going to legislate it. Governor Brown did a masterful job putting the deal together. The deal was done. It was extraordinary. We could prove we can govern. We weren't just focused on finding a crowbar and putting in the spokes of the wheel of the other party to trip them up. We were actually working together. It was more important than the deal itself. The Democratic leaders and the Republican leaders both went back to their respective tribes and expressed the deal. And immediately the persuasion industry moved in and shut that deal down. And it got me thinking, it's not about the guys or the gals in office. It's about the system we've set up. In many ways, the governor was talking to the wrong people. He should have had the persuasion industry in the room and negotiated with them directly, and then they can let the politicians know how to vote. Same with, perfect example, this whole sequester thing. Obama and Boehner had a deal, we're told. At least Woodward claims that's the case, right? But then they went back and it got crushed. It's not about the people, it's the system. And so, you know, I can sit there and blame this machine thinking, this vending model we have, or start to make a case, as I am here, to reinvent that mindset, to open that up. Government as a platform, not a scarce model where we're delivering services in a limited manner, but a framework of abundance and limitlessness. Real, active citizen engagement. That's my case, that's my argument, and I'm grateful you all took the time to be here.
Thank you all. Gavin Newsom.
Gavin Newsom brought citizen engagement to San Francisco as mayor as the internet took root. He's now looking to extend that work to California and even beyond. There are hundreds of stories like this at the Computer History Museum. Please join us next time for another episode of Revolutionaries.